Dr. Mitchell Berg. I'll introduce him in just a second. But let me first also thank not only, of course, Ryan for the prayer, but also, of course, the peoples for whom this land belongs and continues to belong, as well as the other folks who facilitated this event, not only the Institute for Indigenous Knowledge, but also the First Nations Center and the Native American and Indigenous Studies program, with collaboration of all of the Indigenous serving institutes here at Indiana University. Native American Indigenous Studies program also has an event on Monday that you should have received more information about. Mitch Berg has been with us. He's a clinical professor at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. He has been at IU since 2023. Prior to that, he has over 15 years of experience working with various municipalities, primarily in Minnesota, but also throughout the other parts of the Midwest. He's done extensive work with a number of Native American organizations and tribes. Talk about some of that work and his ongoing work here today. So it's our honor to hear from Dr. Mitch Berg. So thank you, Mitch.
Well, I appreciate the welcome, Michael. Thank you to the Institute of Indigenous Knowledge and the First Nations Center for inviting me to present. So first off, I am not, I would say, a traditional academic. I come from many years in the field, and so a lot of the stuff is like foreign to me about how to publish, and I'm used to presenting to city councils, to some extent tribal councils, and when you do that, you digest complicated things in maybe 2 to 3 page memos. When you write something in academia, you're taking 2 to 3 page memos and you're just creating like a 15, 20 page paper. So it was a little challenge for me to get this done, but I actually got a chapter in a book called Indigenous Experiences with Collaborative Governance, Moving Towards Equitable Partnerships. And this was written or edited by Michelle Companion and Jason Rivera, and they have very much made this a very inclusive book. This is a book that looks at collaboration, not just in the U.S. but kind of around the world, because the audience is beyond just the United States or even North America. And so this is authors, both mainly actually Indigenous authors, but when I talk about everything from collaborative governance from an international perspective down to a national perspective, and then down to a municipal or a state and then municipal level. So that's kind of where I fit in this. And then this is a series of different books, and that they're going to have a couple of different volumes. This is a publisher called Berg, and the nice thing about this publisher is that they've open sourced this entire book. So all you got to do is, I think, just log in or register an account. That's free, but you can get the entire book. I'm more than excited to. So let's go to the next. Okay, so as Michael described, it's a little bit about myself. This is the outline of kind of what we'll try and accomplish today. So really what I'm talking about is cooperation at the local level of governments with tribal nations. And with tribal nations, obviously, they have a federal to tribe relationship. So the ability for tribes to and cities to work together, that's been typically there's been a lot of barriers to that. You know, you have a lot of historic trauma and systematic racism between the two entities. In Minnesota, we have 11 tribal nations. 10 of those are open, or we call them checkerboard reservations, if you're familiar with that term. And so you have a lot of fee simple and in tribal land. And I'll be honest, it's mainly fee simple land. The reservation that I was city administrator on, the White Earth Nation, the tribe actually only had about 10% of this land in its ownership. So very little of that land was in tribal trust or even ownership of the tribe. Let me kind of go through here. I'm not going to go through and read kind of PowerPoint on this, but the other thing that I will say is a barrier to cooperate effectively is that if you don't do it, you know, you're unable to really address wicked problems. We'll explain kind of what that means in the next slide. But, you know, one of the challenges that I see too is in Minnesota, there is a law called Public Law 280. And there, I believe there was, Public Law 280 was established in the 1950s. There were 6 states that the federal government basically said when it comes to civil and certain extent criminal and some extent civil regulatory jurisdictional issues, that the federal government is no longer going to do this. It's going to be in the states. And so kind of overnight, if you want to say, all of a sudden, you know, if someone committed a major crime, for instance, that would be now dealt with at the state level and not at federal level. And so this devolution, if you want to call it, of responsibility from the federal level and down to the state level, the state says, you know what, we don't deal with arresting people, for instance. That belongs to the county and the cities. And so what you have then is you have the state devolving that to the local level. So whereas before you had tribes, you know, dealing with major crimes, for instance, on the federal to tribal relation level, now all of a sudden tribes are interacting with, in some cases, counties and cities. And so that, you know, is an example of a kind of a interesting, unique challenge. And because of those incidences that I mentioned about, you know, past racism and everything else, that just compounds that problem. And so it's been a challenge to overcome tribal and city cooperation. But the benefits of it is that, you know, we do see examples of tribes and cities cooperating. And when we do see that, we see great benefits to both parties. But here's some examples. Strengthening tribal governance and the ability for tribal nations to integrate their tribal interests in regional decision making. When COVID-19 hit, the White Earth banned 18,500 enrolled members, about 10,000, 8 to 10,000 actually live on the reservation. You know, they were very concerned about their elders. You know, they were concerned about, you know, the last 2 of their members that hold their language, and it happens to be one where they kind of said, you know, we're an open reservation, and we can't just, you know, vaccinate our members and our people. One, you know, there's so much, you know, non-natives, but there's also intermarriages. There's families, you know, that are members and non-tribal members, or they might be descendants, which are full members. And so what they wanted to do was they wanted to, so they reached out to the counties and the cities, and they said, you know, we want to create a vaccination program for everybody on the reservation. And so we worked with the tribe to get that accomplished. It was, such a great way to build trust and respect, but also, as again, emphasizes how tribes can, strengthen their self-governance and integrate their interests into their regional decision-making. Example, observing tribal sovereignty. There is a example, I want to say back in the early 2000s with the Pichinga tribe in California. They had, I believe, acquired some land that was ancestral land where there was even some tribal members buried on the land. And there was an attempt to build a 500-volt transmission line that would go from like a major transformer or substation to the power company line. And both, since it was an open reservation, the residents that lived there, tribal and non-tribal, didn't want that power line going through their land. And so they were able to get a bill passed that would enable that land to be put into federal tribal trust. And so that basically was used, it was a very powerful example of how tribal sovereignty could be leveraged to stop a project where both parties were, or both tribal and non-tribal members see benefit from. We've seen examples too in, creating win-win situations to tackle wicked and complex problems. I look at the drug epidemic that has been persuasive, not just in Indian country, but across the nation. And, as we know, drugs and overdoses, they don't see, tribal boundary lines or state lines. And so working together, with local governments, even with counties and states and federal government partners, that can go a long ways to supporting this. I could go on with different examples. There's one thing I would say, which the last one though, or the second last one, with creating win-win opportunities, is that the Shakopee Maniwaki Sioux community, which is just south of the Twin Cities area, they were needing more water, and the community that they were both bordering with and had land within part of the lake, they also needed water to grow. And so the two communities, they decided to sit down together, and they built in essence, a joint water treatment plant. They actually buy water from the Shakopee Nation. And so it's a win-win in the sense that both entities are benefiting, and the cost of delivering is now reduced because of the economies of scale. Instead of having two plants, you have one plant.
Yeah.
And plus it supports the environment in a much better manner. So, okay, well, it's talking too much. All right, well, I've never seen that before. Are people online still able to see this?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Doc, what was the example of that plant again? What kind of energy plant was it?
Well, it was a water
It
treatment.
was a water treatment plant, and so it was the municipal government and the tribal government collaborating on the infrastructure
Correct.
upfront costs. Got it, okay.
Yeah.
So we're looking at like public goods production versus provision.
Yes, and I actually have a slide at the end with a link that talks about it from the tribe's perspective. So, all right, so where did I? Let's go. Oh, good.
A lot farther.
Okay, so a little bit about me, as Michael mentioned, I was a city administrator. I was city administrator for about 5 different cities of 16 years. 8 of those years, though, was on the White Indian Reservation, and which is, and I'm still actually kind of consulting with the with both the tribe and the city on different things right now. But to give you a little bit background, so I started in 2007, left in 2009, got my dissertation, wanted to do it on tribal city cooperation, came back in 2015 to work for Wider, left in 2021, and again have been doing different things. since there. But, so I wanted to do this dissertation, and I found this guy by the name of Dr. James Copper. He did a very similar dissertation. And I thought it was really interesting because there's a lack of anything out there. And when he talked about this model for building mutual trust and respect, it was interesting. He modeled it. Well, first he wanted to know what variables led to tribes and cities promoting cooperation. And he found very clearly that it was trust and respect. And so from there he looked at models that were kind of focused on those two key cornerstones, and he found this interesting model actually with the Israeli and Palestinians, because they had such distrust and a lot of lack of respect. And so he created this model. The model was actually really good, but the model was never tested. And the interesting thing about the model was he said, okay, now that you got everybody to the table, make sure you convene a meeting in the next 2 weeks. And having worked in local government, getting people to the table is challenging, but getting this to an agreement, way more challenging. And so I felt that the research was a little light. Nothing against him, because it was great research, but again, I thought it was kind of light. So the model, let's see here, and a couple of those things, those challenges, in my experience, deal with like as simple as who owns the facility, and let's talk about travel sovereignty. It shocked me, although it might not shock you that this would be a major concern, but looking at the SC example, the Shakopee Sioux community in the city of Prairie Lake building this water treatment plant, I said, if there is an issue, which court does this go to? Does this go to tribal court or state court? Because that's a big issue, right? Especially when you're dealing with two different jurisdictions. And they said, well, in the agreement we got it that since the water treatment plant and everything, I believe it's technically owned by the SMSC, it said it goes to tribal court. I said, how the heck did you convince the city of Prairie Lake to get something approved like that? And they said, well, our court system is very, well respected, and they know that. So they said again that building of trust and respect. But he also said they also acknowledged that if this went to district court, it could be just as tied up in in time and everything. And so what we ended up doing as the Shakopee Nation was they basically gave like a $2 million escrow that says that if this ever go to court, you can tap into the escrow account to get water from someplace else until it's kind of remediated. So I thought, okay, that's pretty ingenious. So I gotta make sure I'm going a long time here. But, okay, so here is kind of, again, what the research that Collar was looking at and how I wanted to expand my work. And so I am, again, one where I'm a city administrator. I just go ahead and do things. Academia is always about grounded on theory. And so when I actually put together this chapter, actually for a publication I wanted to do with a different journal, they said, Mitch, did you know you followed this cultural responsibility evaluation framework? And I said, I did. And they said, yeah, go look at it. So I said, okay. And sure enough, I did. And basically what it means is, what I wanted to do was, when we go back to Collard's example with 39 tribal nations, he got 11 to participate in this research. I have 11 tribes in Minnesota. If I got a third of the response, that'd give me 3. And I said, I need a little bit better response. And just, my experience with working with my tribal nation, I wanted to, build better relationships with them. I thought too, building better relationships would not only, get a better response, but it would also legitimize research that I'm doing and actually enable me to, present this to, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups, because after all, that is at the end of the day what we want to do with research, right? We don't want it just to sit on the bookshelf and just sit there. We want people to take those nuggets of information. There it is. Okay, so, yep, this is it. So, and a lot of you may or may not know kind of the landscape about Minnesota. So I did get 9 out of the 11 tribal nations to participate in the survey, and I got between 25 cities and counties to participate as well. Just to give you kind of an overview of Minnesota, there are 2 major groups. There's the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, which are 7 tribal nations, and then the 4 of them are the Dakota or Sioux, and we see the separation between the 2. And of course, you really want to know quickly about the history. The Ojibwe tribal nations have more established tribal boundaries, and it was because during 1862, I believe, around there, there was a conflict between the Dakota and the United States government, where the governor then basically said, I'm throwing all of the Dakota out of Minnesota. So they lost their status as tribes and they lost their land. For those that are not familiar, to this day, I believe it was 36 Dakota men and women were hung, which makes this still to date the largest mass execution hanging in U.S. history. And so when you, so on the Ojibwe side, this is a really unique situation too, is because again, the Red Lake Nation, which is up on the far north west side, that is a completely closed reservation. They never adopted the DOS Act, and so, and I'll mention this in a little second, but and then the 6 other Dakota or Ojibwe tribes are actually, it's a very unique system. They're bands, and they all fall under the umbrella of one government called the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, but they're in themselves separate tribal nations as well. So and just to, just for my own sake, when I went and I contacted all the 9 tribal reservations, the very first 2 were Red Lake and Shakopee. And one of the things that excited me was they were so excited to share, about their cooperation, which kind of astonished me because, I'll just say Shakopee is probably one of the top 10 wealthiest tribes in the nation. And as people say, well, Mitch, we want cooperation, we just buy it. And the Red Lake Nation has this different mentality because they're a close reservation. But anyways, I've had great success, and to this day I have good relationships with the executive director over at Shakopee, as well as leadership within the Red Lake tribe. All right, so key analysis. Basically, my dissertation looked at over 20 variables, but the publisher said, Mitch, you got 8,000 words, so we're going to limit you to what you feel you want to talk about. So I threw out these 5, obviously trust and respect being that those were what Collard's variables showed to be very important. And I used kind of a method for seeing if there was truth or validity with this data, and I used this method called ANOVA. And I use this example, if it's sticking out of the clouds, then there's some, maybe some truth to this. And while ANOVA lets you know about if there's statistical significance, meaning that the results between different groups are not done by random error. It doesn't exactly tell you which in this case, which skyscraper is the one that, you know, is the right one. So you have to do a little bit more research to kind of get to where you need to go. So just in a very nutshell here, for promoting cooperation, of the 20 variables, or in the 5 that I mentioned here, only trust was the only variable that had statistical significance. And it wasn't even, you know, it was a U-shaped type of a trust, where there were differences, obviously, statistical significance between 3, which means that is neither disagree or agree that the leaders felt trust was important to promoting trust. There's statistical significance between 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. It's interesting that between 1 and 2 and 4 and 5 there's not a lot of difference here. Here's the kicker though, and I used the same 20 variables to measure promotion as I did in achieving agreement, because I wanted to see if there were similarities or differences. And here's what we got. There were 3 variables that stood out, meaning statistical significance. One was, again, trust, but in here you see it. There's a correlation, right? So that as people disagree or selectively disagree, which is 1 and 2, to all of a sudden going to agree and strongly disagree, there is a correlation that the more that you trust the other partner, the greater the ability is to reach achievement. And what we mean by these sums or the counts there is, again, I interviewed 11 or 9 tribes and 25 cities and counties, but in some cases there were some tribes that had multiple relationships with the same city or county. And so when you add up all those different, you know, I don't know what the statistical term is, but all those, you know, pairs, you get a total of about 52 different parables. That's why you're seeing the count of 7 plus 14 plus 22 be higher than the 35 that are in there. But the same applies to mutual respect. As you can see, the higher the level of respect that that the leaders from both parties thought of each other, the greater the likelihood of achieving intergovernmental agreement. Here's the interesting thing, because the Collard found trust and respect as being pivotal, right, for promoting intergovernmental agreement. I did not see that. It did not achieve statistical significance. Not only that, but my research findings found that it was flipped. The greater, the less likely someone was to promote or was to have respect, the more likelihood that they were to want to promote cooperation. And I asked a tribal leader about that, and they basically said, perhaps it's because when people have less respect towards the other person, that other person will try and make a greater effort to try and gain that person's respect. I'm not exactly sure, you know, if that would be true, but, you know, I will say that this tribal leader was very, very, very respected. They actually worked for President Obama's affairs person, so I would tend to agree with what she said. But having said that, the other variable for meeting statistical significance in achieving intergovernmental agreement was interpersonal ties. And again, this is a little different, but you can see clearly that you know, the stronger the ties, the greater the ability is to achieve agreement. So where am I on time here? I know that
We're at 12:45.
I can fast forward very quickly. I think I got 6 slides left here. So as we talk about you know, trust, building trust is essential. And some of the things that I would say is, if you don't have trust and you want to create trust between tribes and local governments, you know, pick some low-hanging fruit that you can quickly, work together on and accomplish. That will help to build that trust, so you can work together. The other thing that was mentioned was the Shakopee Sioux Nation, or Shakopee Maniwaki Sioux community, said that they belong to a group called SCALE, Scott County. It's an innovation and alliance group, and they said, we belong to the troop, and what we appreciate about it is we sit at the table as an equal partner. We're not talked down to. We are valued for what we have to bring to the table, and that helps to build that trust. And trust helps to build respect. And so here, we talk about, how do we build respect, and so how do we build, better communications. What I've always done as a city leader is trying not to be transactional with the tribe. It's very easy to do that. I need you to give me money, and you need a service. Very easy, but I would remember having conversations with our tribal leader. He would call me up and he said, Mitch, I'm having the inauguration for the new tribal council. What do you think? Should we do fish, walleye, or should we not? And they said they don't want me to do fish because it costs too much money. I said, whatever you want fish, just be persistent on fish. Thanks, Mitch. And he'd hang up on me. And I'm like, okay, that was the weirdest conversation. But, and I would call the tribe up and say, hey, we have a council race coming up, or a mayor race coming up. I really want some strong candidate. Do you have anybody you'd recommend? And that just, created that dialogue that, I wasn't just calling them every time for a handout or something. So, again, so when we talk about lessons learned, it's really about, going from transactional relationships to being transformational relationships, having meaningful dialogue. And there's so many examples I can go for, but I'll kind of skip on this. So getting to the last 3 slides here, the biggest takeaways are, build trust and earn respect. Again, if it's hard to build trust, and just pick some first find areas of mutuality and do very low-hanging things, so you can start to build that trust. Make an intentional effort to understand each other's history and culture. I'll just say, each tribe in Minnesota is unique. Talking in the choir, you guys know that as well. But also, tribes also have to understand, governments, local governments are different. Some are charter, some are statutory. And so, I'll give you a quick example. The prior Secretary Treasurer of the Warrior Nation just got elected on the county board. And I just mentioned to him, I said, being on the tribal council is a lot different than the county board. And he said, yeah, I know, Mitch. I said, okay, do you know? So I said, here's what I'd like to do. I've got a buddy of mine who's actually running for the tribal chair position for Red Lake right now. But he's on the county board for Beltrami County. I reached out to him. I said, would you be a mentor to him? Because he's been in the position now for several years. He leads the Association of Minnesota Counties Tribal Intergovernmental Affairs Committee. I said, would you be a mentor to him? He said, yep. So, I suggested that to Robert. I said, here's somebody, no force, if you want to reach out to him, it's up to you. But he said he's more than willing to kind of mentor with you. And then the other thing that I would basically say too is, because cities sometimes, we think, okay, I'm not going to call the police chief, I'm going to call the city administrator. And a lot of tribal government forms, the tribal administrator might not be needed to do that. You might be best suited to reach the tribal chairperson, or in some cases too, it is fine to go to a tribal frontline employee, and vice versa with the other. You know, it doesn't always have to be the city administrator you reach out to or the mayor of that city. You know, when I was doing my dissertation, trying to get better, you know, in front of the MCT, they said to me, they said, Mitch, talk to the TEC, the Tribal Education Committee. I'm like, well, what the heck does the TEC have to do with what I'm doing? He said, Mitch, the more people you can get in front of, the greater trust that they'll have with you. So I said, okay, I'll go ahead and do that. The other thing I would just add is, you know, celebrate successes. I don't know if it's Minnesota that we're very humble, but I think it's across the nation. We don't celebrate our successes, our travel successes, our city successes. So when you do something together, promote it. And that lets other people know that you are doing the right thing. So here's an example. Here's, for instance, the Shakopee and Latin Sioux example, but here's other examples of travel cooperation. And with that, I will open it up. I'll bring it back to you.
Yes. About 10 minutes or so for some discussion, and maybe I'll start by asking a question for you, because I've thought a little bit about thinking about trust and things like this, right? Like, is there something that makes working with local governments easier to build trust than working with, let's say, state or the federal government? I'm just thinking, like, in that respect, right? Like the trust deficit with indigenous peoples, when you think about the country of America, for instance, right? Like that trust deficit is huge. And then I'm thinking here about cases like in Hawaii, for instance. The state of Hawaii, the trust deficit with the state of Hawaii for Native Hawaiians is also pretty large, right? And so there are a number of kind of shared problems with the production of energy, for instance, in Hawaii. And the state will, every so many decades, propose using volcanic energy to kind of create energy. And on the one hand, that's a very good solution to the problem. On the other hand, it involves going after something that Native Hawaiians consider to be a deity. And the trust deficit is so large in some regards that working with the state, you know, it tends to fall apart pretty quick. And then oftentimes, even when it seems to move along, sometimes the state's position seems to be something like, well, tell us what we can do to build trust with you so we can do the thing that we want to do. You know what I'm saying? And so like, it's almost as if, right, like their intention to build trust, right, like isn't really to build trust, right? It's just to be able to do what they want to do in the first place.
Yeah. You know, I'll just say, you know, I'm not a magical solution. You know, I still have had difficulty, you know, getting and working with the tribe, you know, on matters. But there's things I would say, you know, tribes and cities need to kind of, again, understand how they can mutually benefit each other. I'll give you a couple of examples here. You know, in local, and I teach a field, and I'm just, it's almost like right now people are like, oh, maybe I don't want to go in federal government. I'm like, I never want to go in federal government in the first place. And the reason is because, you know, we get things done with the local level. You know, if you talk about the federal and the state level, yeah, that's great that you can get $40 billion or all this stuff, but, you know, where the rubber hits the road of working with people is at the local level. And so, you know, if we want to work with tribes, we can let them know, you know, we are we're the lowest unit of government that interacts with the people. And so we can probably get things going a lot better in terms of relationship building. The second thing that I would kind of say too is, you know, because of that federal to federal or tribal relationship, we've seen things where, you know, a city wants a role, or a tribe and city want to work together on building a bridge or road. Well, the federal government then can go ask for federal funding, you know, and then the city can go through state channels for state funding, and we can leverage two different sources than if we were to work in isolation, separately apart.
And I think that's
And I don't know
great.
if that answered the question.
That certainly gets at it.
Okay.
So-
I think,
Yeah, I have no.
Oops, I think.
No, please, no, mine's not.
Okay, so this is interesting for me. Like, I just want to ask first, like in terms of methodology, like ANOVA. This is like very new to me. So,
Okay.
I know that like working with government as a researcher, both like researcher and the university, you really have to be strict with like the method you use, like, which is like very measurable, right? Like ANOVA approach itself is very statistical. So how do you, like in terms of like your connection as a researcher from university, working with also local government, like now you want to like connect both sides, right, with the local indigenous people. How will you, what way you use to translate that like statistical, measurable like data
Okay.
analysis or like explanation to the local people? That's always a challenge.
Yeah, how are
For
you
me, like,
translating your research?
how you translate that research? Because like I like working like with 6 years back in Indonesia, like it's just always
Yeah.
difficult to like
Yeah.
connect this like what government wants, almost like statistical analysis.
Yeah.
The results that can be measured.
Yeah.
Like you cannot tell that to like local people.
It's extremely hard because, you know, and I would say it's regardless if it's travel or non-travel, you know, we all work in as much as we'd like to think social media paves the way. Like I'll give you an example. This presentation got over 1,400 hits on my LinkedIn profile. The number of people that are here though is about 30 people. So, you know, what I always say is that one-to-one relationship conversation, and I think that's the challenging part. And so it's hard for me to give you a good case because I'm still trying to figure it out. You know, I've gone to a lot of entities and said, you know, here, I'm happy to speak on this topic. Sometimes I get bites, other times I don't get bites. Sometimes I get 5 people in a room, other times I get 100 people in the room. I will accept that though, because hopefully they can say, yep, I learned something, or I want to bring you to another group, if that helps answer the question, or is that?
Not really.
Okay.
That's a kind of like a perennial question
Okay.
that I have always like all the time. How like to like bringing down to earth that kind of like, you know?
How to bring data down to earth?
Yes.
Well,
Because like the principle of ANOVA, like bringing
Okay.
trust, just does not mean that like okay you how many people and you can like you know involve in that kind of, but like how to translate that kind of,
Yeah.
like because the statistical data is also involved in this
yeah.
system, right? Like bringing out that trust means like you also need to translate that. I'm able to translate that to the local. This is the way I do it.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, so, and I don't know if I'm exactly answering this, but if I'm presenting this to a, you know, to a community group, I'm not going to bring up anything about
Yeah, right.
the statistics. I'm just going to share, you know what, hey, you know, I've met with tribal governments, I've met with cities and counties in Minnesota, you know, this is what this is what I found. And, you know, I've done, again, this isn't talking about my whole dissertation, I did a qualitative component too, and I did post interviews. So I have a lot of that, you know, real, you know, like, you know, down to earth conversations with people. Just as I talked about, well, why did the research say, you know, this? Here's something else that's completely interesting. So in my head, I thought, you know, again, because we're all about relationships and it's that face-to-face communication that's important. So I did a study with the dissertation that looked at the center of the city county government headquarters to the tribal headquarters. And it did not meet statistical significance, but my hypothesis was the closer you were, the more likely you were to promote cooperation and achieve agreement, right?
Mm-hmm.
Opposite. It was the farther you were, the more likely you'd have leaders that would want to cooperate and reach agreement.
That's wild.
So, and it was correlated. Like I had 1 mile, 20 miles, 50 miles, 100 miles, and it didn't go like this. It just went like that. And I went to people and I said, well, what the heck's going on? And they said, and this was talking with, I'd ask my white counterparts and they'd be like, oh, I don't know. And I asked my American Indian friends and they'd be like, well, we know the answer. And I go, okay, tell me, because obviously I'm not getting it. And they said, Mitch, and one person said this, he said, people down in Twin Cities, for instance, they look at us Native Americans as some mythical creature. And so they want to work with us. When you're smack dab right there, you're dealing with the institutional racism, the historic trauma. You've got those barriers you have to contend with. You don't have that with an entity that is, quite frankly, far removed. And you say, okay, now that makes sense, because that goes back to that, what are those barriers, trauma, racism, etc. Long story short about that, but that's kind of what I, add into the context of some of these conversations, so that it is a lot more, that makes sense.
Right?
So I guess, I'm more of an interventionist and an institutionalist, so like it's easy for me to look at this more through like a social network analytical lens and look at it in terms of two things. One, how can we empiricize the existing qualitative measures of trust so that we can drill down on exactly what types of institutions are more open for collaboration. Like I would imagine that certain things around like public goods production for things like sharing bridges or sharing water infrastructure, there's enough like game theoretic incentive overlap that they can collaborate on something very physical because it's not getting into the weeds of historicity and like emotional distance because of like a history of racism. So that's one. A method of analysis in social network analysis that might drive deeper empirical solidity to your ANOVA analysis on your trust index would be to use something called spatial autoregression. And your social network map has a few enough nodes that you could really like model this in real time. You wouldn't even have to make a toy model of it. It's small enough. And what you could do is to construct a measure whereby you could see, like, let's say that there's one chief that's very central as a hub in the social network, and they tend to have interactions, they prefer interactions over bridges and water infrastructure, let's say. So they have a lot of experience talking with people who do infrastructure. So they're hearing about infrastructure all the time, and because each time they talk to that one person that does roads or bridges and that person that does waterways, that solidifies one more time that connection empirically between those people in that domain. And so with spatial autoregression, you could actually, we've measured this with things like smoking cessation, for example. So with your social network is comprised of people, maybe let's say out of 10 people, 3 of them smoke. Well, you'll interact with the smokers, and every time you do, you'll think it's a little cooler. You'll be a little more likely to be like, maybe I'll light one up. But then you hit those other 7 people more often, and you're like, oh, most people don't like this. This is unhealthy, and I actually kind of really like those reasonings. So this takes a really brute force understanding of the human mind that it's around like neuro-linguistic processing. So like if you hear the same message over and over and over again, you're likely to each time absorb it a little bit more. Well, we can do the same thing about measuring norms, for example. So around norms of trust, you can drill down to find what kinds of characteristics, or if you want to take your index of trust and break that into submetrics, you can drill down to see what kinds of specific values or what types of specific trade-offs tend to be reinforced in these network relationships. So you can make like a heat map of the network, and you can see what people tend to reach out to what people more, so that you can know where are fertile territories for later policy agreement, because on that heat map will show you where there are uncovered sets of incentives that overlap, places where we can agree, right? And Bill Bianco in poli-sci, he models uncovered set stuff. I think that could actually really be useful to overlay on the social network aspect here. And then just from like a more Ostermite kind of institutional perspective, like how we institutionalize trust can be slow. But as soon as we have the network that connects to people, if we can start by even, like you were saying, making small agreements, so we get better and better at, first we have a very small 1-part agreement, then it's a 2-part agreement, then it's a 10-part agreement, then it's a 50-part plan, then more governments are involved, right? So, but if you build your institution slowly, you can lock in that trust that is more interpersonal, emotional, historical, right? And there's a lot of like emotion there, but if we can lock in the gains of trust using legal forms of institutions around basic agreements and contracting, then we can empirically build institutional support to hold that trust. I'm ranting now, but that's 3 different layers of analysis that you can integrate with this.
Yeah, and so a couple of things, you know, I like that spatial mapping concept. A lot of the things in the qualitative study, you know, I looked at, and as you know, was just mainly exploratory research. So I love the idea that, you know, you come up with ideas of like, you know, build on this.
Light me up, let's work together.
But it was really interesting to see, you know, a lot of it was people were, you know, I said, well, what made you guys come to an agreement? A change in leadership.
Okay.
We got a new tribal chairperson or a new mayor, and they just said, enough, you know, we need to get together. And, you know, it kind of defeats that statistical analysis step where you say, well, here's how you can build a thing. If you follow all of these things, no, sometimes it just boils down to the person. It's just said, I want to work with this city. I'm tired of, you know, always going to court or whatever. Let's get together. The other thing that it was the latter part.
Institution.
Yeah. So one of the bases of my research was a person named Christopher Ansentera. He's and Jennifer Nelson. They bring a lot of research on intergovernmental partnerships and with Canadian. You know, municipalities, provinces, and tribal First Nations up there. And they looked at, you know, the idea and the concept of, you know, do tribes that and local governments start with an agreement and build up on them, you know, are they able to create more enduring transformational agreements? No. And I said a lot of it is still very much transactional.
Okay.
And you know, that's a perfect example with Wire, where we had a contract with the sheriff's department, and the sheriff, when you think of Barney or whatever his name is, Fife, that was like that, and we were like, no. So, and they're like, well, you can't go anywhere. I went, yeah, sure we can. We can go ask the tribe for a contract. So we did, and the contract was for 2 people, and I was gone by that time that they did. But I came back and I said, you know what, let's do 3. And the tribe said, if you do 3, we will pay for your 4th. And so I said, great, we'll do a 4th one. So then, you know, that's one where you're talking about how it just adds up. Then we said, you know what, we want to do community policing. And they said, okay, let's do that. We're going to hire community police people. That's where the wheels on the bus fell apart. The tribe had some internal issues, and they just kept recycling through their personnel and community policing, and then they kind of dropped the ball. So we just, okay, that's kind of ending right there. That was unfortunate because I was thinking of really building.
Yeah.
And of course, then you know you talk about, well, see, we got this great police thing. Let's talk about, you know, this and that. Nope. You know, don't want to do that. We're only focusing on police. So it can be challenging, but I do agree with you with that. There should be a way to create an institutional framework that can help to push that along.
Well, good. I'll just intercede real quickly here because we're a bit over time, although we certainly did start late. We can continue the conversation. There's more food. Please grab some food, take some food home if you'd like. You're also welcome to hang out here at the Institute. And so let's maybe conclude here by, again, thanking